Hi folks, Andrew Flannery here, or as my friends call me, Baba G. It's a hair thing. Have you ever been asked a question when you're on camera or on stage, and even though you knew the info to answer the question, you rattled off a bunch of incoherent nonsense before you even had a chance to think about it? Now, if you've had that experience and want a really cool tip, then listen on. In a training I was on during the week, the inestimable Demian Khoury looked us in the eye and he channeled Carl Jung when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Now his point, which I'm paraphrasing, was that we're all run by a series of beliefs and habits which control our lives, but which are often invisible to us. We just think that this is the way that life is. I was reminded of my psychology days and also a great book called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, which may just have the perfect tool to help us with this. Of course, we could engage in mindfulness meditation so that the passing pageantry of our mind takes on distinct character form. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of that. But a more accessible tool may be inhibition, as Daniel Goleman specifically defined that term in his book, Emotional Intelligence. Now, Goleman argued that we live most of our life in a stimulus-response world. And if there is any level of stress or pressure involved, then our response is routinely triggered by the amygdala, that little almond-shaped cluster of nerve cells located deep within the temporal lobe of the brain's cerebrum. And that little powerhouse, which governs the adrenal axis, is the fight or flight response. Now, of course, our best decision-making, our best option-generating ability is done by the prefrontal cortex, the more modern part of our mammalian brain. But it is orders of magnitude slower to respond to stimuli than the much more ancient amygdala or reptilian brain. The prefrontal cortex may take part of a second. The amygdala takes milliseconds. But often, we don't even get to roll out the big guns of the prefrontal cortex because we've already reacted with the reflective autonomic response. Now, Goleman argues that as a matter of physiology, we cannot access the prefrontal cortex in a time of stress or pressure. We just can't access that area of our brain. And neither would we want to, because if we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, we don't want to stop and pause and calculate the appropriate escape velocity. We just need to run. But the problem is that on stage and in most of life, running just doesn't work. Now, while we cannot access automatically the prefrontal cortex in times of stress or pressure, we can train a pathway which defaults to the prefrontal cortex by consistent practice in advance. And he calls that trained behaviour inhibition, because we train ourselves to inhibit the autonomic response. Now, I know this is getting heavy, so stay with me because I'm about to land this plane. He suggests that practicing in a no-stress, hypothetical environment is the key, and training a desired response, which involves firstly recognising a stimulus, then taking a deep breath between stimulus and response, which gives the prefrontal cortex time to spool up. Now let's just see what that means. It means something occurs, and before we react, we take a breath between the stimulus and the response to give time for the prefrontal cortex to spool up. And it may be that during that time you also ask a good question to fully engage the phenomenal power of the prefrontal cortex. Maybe this is still sounding like scientific nonsense. Maybe just take the words from Shania Twain in her song, "Don't Be Stupid." In that great song, she sang, "Don't freak out until you know the facts. Relax." Now, as speakers, this is particularly important for us because we're often put on the spot with questions and comments from the audience, and we rattle out some incoherent response without structuring it. Even if this is something we know very well, and may have even studied deeply. And it's not just speaking. This life skill of inhibition is just as important when our teenager blurts out that they hate life and intend to leave school at year 10 and you're the worst father in the world. The intentional inhibition process in any of these circumstances would work like this. 1. Recognize that this stimulus, this question or circumstance is something that is deep, complex or multifaceted and probably hard to explain. So recognize. 2. Take one deep diaphragmatic breath and breathe out slowly. Now, interestingly, it's actually the out-breath which triggers the magic of our parasympathetic nervous system. And 3, ask a good question like, how can I explain this in a way that is good for me, good for the questioner, and good for humanity? And then maybe anchor that in your physiology. And you're saying, what's anchor in your physiology? Well, there's a cool thing we can do. If we play a question in our mind, we say, how can I ask this in a way that's good for me, good for my audience, good for humanity? And then we run our hands through our hair. And we do it again. How can I answer this question in a way that's good for me, good for the audience, good for humanity? Run your hand through your hair. How can I do this in a way that's good for me, good for the audience, good for humanity? Run your hands through your hair. How can I do this in a way that's good for me, good for the audience, good for humanity? Run your hand through your hair. After a while, all you'll have to do is run your hand through your hair. And that question is anchored or embodied in your physiology. So that really, if you see the stimulus and you breathe, and as you do it, run your hand through your hair, you've run the whole protocol. 1, 2, 3. And number 4, respond like a boss. Because you've given your prefrontal cortex the time to assimilate the question and package the answer. And in fact, you respond like a sage. And the final step, of course, is rinse and repeat. Do this many times. And remember that practice doesn't necessarily make perfect. Practice makes permanent. I had a university lecturer. Pat Lane was his name. He was one of the true geniuses I've known personally. He was wildly, floridly eccentric, but his mercurial brilliance was unmistakable. When he was asked a worthy question, he would smile, close his eyes, place his 10 fingers on his forehead, extend his elbows to the sky, and stand there looking like some moose avatar in communion with the Great Spirit. Then he'd open his eyes, passion firing from his eyes, and provide an answer that was fully parsed, packaged, and replete with distilled wisdom, and also case citations from the Commonwealth Law Report. He truly had a freakish recall. But even he needed to structure his response. Now, maybe none of us can be like Pat Lane, and maybe none of us want to be. But for any of us who are blessed with curiosity and a learner's heart, the information is never the problem. And the rich tapestry of our lived experience makes every one of us experts in our field. No, it's not the information, it's the redaction. It's the editing process that's the key. Reducing the firmament of our ideas, the giant vastness of our philosophy, to the necessary concepts and vocabulary to make them accessible to others. That's the challenge. And this task is just too much for the amygdala. It doesn't have enough grunt to deal with that order of processing. So, here is the challenge. Learn to access the prefrontal cortex in times of stress and pressure, and install the habit of inhibition into your daily life by using and repeating the simple 4-step process that I outlined above. What are those steps again? Recognize a complex issue or stressful situation. 2, take a breath and breathe out slowly. 3, as you do that, ask yourself a good question and anchor that question in your body. And 4, answer like a boss. My friends, this simple hack will change your life. Until next time, folks. Namaste.